Hello, dear viewers and listeners. In this series of Balkan narrative programs, we're going to examine a topic called Muslim, or Bosniak, the issue of Muslim identity in Bosnia and Herzegovina. What we're diving into today is, well, it's a really complex question, isn't it? The identity of Muslims in Bosnia and Herzegovina, specifically looking at the nuances and the debates around these two key terms, Muslim and Bosniak.
Exactly. And to, make sense of this, we'll be drawing on excerpts from the study, Bosniak and Muslim Identity in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Yeah.
Our goal here is really to unpack the historical, the political, and the cultural layers that feed into these terms and the discussions that are still happening.
Right.
And it's also just crucial to understand the pressures Bosnian Muslims have faced, and frankly continue to face, both regionally and internationally, just in trying to define who they are.
Okay, so let's maybe start with that historical backdrop. It seems nationalism has been such a powerful force there, especially after Yugoslavia broke apart.
Oh, absolutely, a defining force.
And it's really striking that, according to the study, Bosnian Muslim thinkers have spent, decades trying to draw this line between Bosniak and Muslim. Why did that distinction become so critical?
Well, that's a great question. What's fascinating here is this constant sort of push and pull, right, between the internal intellectual work, the thinking going on, and then these very real external pressures. I mean, even today, you see nationalist sentiments present in Serbia, Montenegro, Croatia, and even within Bosnia and Herzegovina itself. That creates a really challenging environment for Bosnian Muslims trying to articulate their political identity.
Right, because the study points out, and this is key, that the Orthodox and Catholic populations in Bosnia largely identify as Serbs or Croats. They align themselves with Serbia and Croatia.
Yes, that alignment is strong.
So for Bosnian Muslims, figuring out their identity isn't just like a cultural preference. It feels more fundamental, almost an act of self-preservation, finding their place in this region with such strong nationalist currents swirling around them.
Exactly. Self-preservation is a good way to put it. And it's really vital to be clear here. Acknowledging nationalism in Muslim political thought isn't about, validating some old, tired theory about ethnic conflict being inevitable.
Yeah, no.
It's more about recognizing the very real, tangible, historical pressures they were under. Since the mid-19th century, you had both Serbian and Croatian nationalism actively aiming to diminish the role, the presence of Muslims in the region. It wasn't just about cultural differences, it was actively trying to marginalize them.
Which, sadly, brings us to some incredibly dark moments in history, the Bosnian War. I mean, the loss of over 140,000 Muslim lives, those disappearances. The study notes this was just the third in a series of 20th century conflicts and, genocides experienced by Muslims there.
It wasn't an isolated tragedy, it was part of a pattern.
And if you connect that to the bigger picture, you see this pattern of, aggressive nationalist ambition. The Serbian plan in the 80s for a greater Serbia, that directly involved tearing Bosnia and Herzegovina apart.
That was the stated goal.
Yeah. And similarly, the rise of Croatian nationalism in the early 90s led to agreements specifically aimed at partitioning Bosnia, just carving it up like territory.
Yeah, treating it like it was up for grabs. So this drive to define identity wasn't happening in some academic bubble. It was a response to very, very real threats.
And in that incredibly volatile atmosphere, Bosnian Muslims were often painted by the radical elements, Serbs and Croats, as foreigners, traitors, infidels, just completely othered.
Dehumanized.
Caught right in the middle of these larger nationalist projects facing existential threats. So given that intense backdrop, how do we even start defining what these terms Muslim and Bosniak actually mean?
That's a crucial question, and it brings up the language itself. The study clarifies that Muslim, usually with a lowercase m in the Bosnian context, primarily refers to someone who follows Islam or is born into a Muslim family. It's, a religious identifier.
Okay, religious.
But Bosniak, that's the Bosnian term, it has Ottoman Turkish roots and essentially means Bosnian, comes from Bosna plus the suffix jak. And the capitalization, switching to a capital B, signifies that shift beyond just religious affiliation.
That's interesting. And even the linguistics, looking at Serbian and Croatian dictionaries, adds layers. Stevanovic suggests Osen isn't necessarily ethnic, while Osen, like in Bonjanin, points more to national affiliation, simply meaning Bosnian.
Right, there's some debate there.
But then Sfax's dictionary suggests Osenin can sometimes imply nationality in the sense of man. So the roots of the words themselves are a bit ambiguous.
Precisely. And that linguistic nuance kind of mirrors the whole debate we're looking at. As the study highlights, this deep dive is analyzing these different takes on nationalism as they're expressed through these key terms. And nationalism at its core is this belief, right, that a large group forms a distinct political community, a nation, and they deserve their own independent state.
So after Tito died in 1980, this question of political identity for Slavic Muslims in Bosnia really picked up steam. What did that conversation look like in those last years of communism?
What's really significant then is this resurgence of interest in past culture, especially the Ottoman Islamic heritage. You see a real focus on cultural heritage, on national and religious traditions.
A kind of cultural revival.
In a sense, yes.
Yeah.
And this discourse kept going, despite, enormous external pressures. You had Belgrade's expansionist aims, radical Serbian nationalism wanting a greater Serbia, which meant getting rid of Muslims, radical Croatian nationalism looking to annex parts of Bosnia, and then, tragically, the horrific violence of the Bosnian War itself. It's almost like this cultural focus was a form of, resistance against those forces.
It's such a stark contrast to the Serbian and Croatian nationalist talk at the time, which was all about exclusion, creating these ethnically pure states.
Completely different goals.
But the study emphasizes that Bosnian Muslim culture, rooted in its religious and ethical principles, isn't inherently based on racial superiority.
That's a really crucial distinction. The religious teachings emphasize the equality of all people, regardless of background. Differences are seen as ways to identify and understand each other, not to dominate. This inherent cultural leaning was arguably a major factor preventing a kind of supremacist nationalism developing among Muslims directed at Serbs and Croats.
However, the study does acknowledge, and this is important, that you can't just ignore the influence of nationalist literature on Bosnian Muslim political thought. Many intellectuals were influenced by Marxism or other nationalist ideas floating around.
Absolutely. It wasn't happening in a vacuum. To really get this, you have to look at the former Yugoslavia itself. The study describes it as, an artificial society, based on ideology, that maybe was always going to fall apart because it couldn't meet everyone's needs and expectations.
Right. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia after World War I, largely put together by Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, but with Serbs really dominating. They saw it as fulfilling their national goals. That set a tone early on.
A tone of imbalance, definitely.
Right.
With Serbs holding key government and military posts. And then World War II just fragments everything further. You get the independent state of Croatia, Hitler intending Bosnia to be part of it, forcing another redefinition of who belonged where.
Yeah.
Constant upheaval.
A real mess.
Total mess. Then, after WWII, Tito and the communists come in and they implement this specific model of national identity. Tito aimed to clamp down on Serbian and Croatian nationalism, but the study suggests Serbian nationalists largely kept their influence within the socialist government anyway. The tensions didn't just vanish.
It's interesting that the study really stresses that Tito's Yugoslavia wasn't truly a unified nation. It was a federation of different nationalities. The Yugoslav identity itself never really took root as a natural, deeply felt thing for most people. Why do you think that was?
Well, the study argues that in practice, very few people genuinely embraced Yugoslav as their primary identity. It often felt secondary to their ethnic identities, Serb, Croat, Slovene, etc. It never really worked as a unifying supranational identity.
It wasn't organic.
Exactly. It wasn't an organic growth from the political culture, the society, the history, the geography. And a fundamental flaw, arguably, in the Yugoslav constitution was recognizing ethnicity as the very foundation of nationhood right from the start, instead of maybe focusing on shared citizenship or civic values.
So instead of emphasizing the geographical units, the republics, the Constitution focused on racial or ethnic identity. And that left Muslims in this really ambiguous spot, Slavic origin, but Muslim faith. The system itself created a problem for them.
Precisely. In those first decades, it essentially forced Muslims to choose either Serb or Croat identity as their politically recognized identity. Other groups without a clear political or national box in the system, Muslims, Hungarians, Albanians, had to pick from the existing options. And this probably contributed to why Yugoslav felt like a less substantial, less organic choice for many.
So what was Tito's specific view on Muslim identity within this really complex setup? Did he offer them a clear path?
Tito didn't see Muslims as a distinct political and social entity like Serbs or Croats, more like an ethnic community. However, he did push back against the more extreme right-wing interpretations that insisted Muslims had to politically identify as Serb or Croat.
Okay.
He even suggested, look, if Muslims feel Yugoslav, they should identify as Yugoslav. He said nobody had the right to impose a nationalist identity if someone just felt like a citizen of Yugoslavia.
But that position must have immediately run into opposition from the Serbian and Croatian nationalists, right? They had their own very fixed ideas.
Oh, absolutely. Tito's comments flew right in the face of the radical Serbian and Croatian views that denied Muslims even a distinct ethnic identity, let alone national. They argued Muslims weren't a cohesive nation, didn't have the right characteristics, and were fundamentally either Croats or Serbs who'd converted to Islam. So they argued their true national identity was Croat or Serb.
And chillingly, both those nationalist lines of thought concluded that ethnic cleansing was necessary to sort out these supposedly true national identities.
Tragically, yes. That was the logical endpoint for those ideologies.
And some nationalists even cooked up these, frankly, bizarre terms like Muslim Serbs or Mohammedan Serbs, or the idea that Muslims were just Croats of Islamic faith. It's such a clear attempt to just erase any distinct Muslim identity and absorb them.
A complete denial of their selfhood. Now, this study also points out something interesting. Yugoslavia inherited elements of the Ottoman millet system, where religious affiliation was a significant factor in identity. This counters some views that the Ottomans only used religion. While loyalty to the state and territory was key for the Ottomans, religion also mattered, and they recognized various ethnic and national groups within the empire.
And even though non-Muslims, the people of the book, didn't have equal political status, it wasn't the same kind of violent erasure we see later.
Correct. The study emphasizes the Ottomans never carried out systematic genocide or ethnic cleansing against Christians. In Ottoman Bosnia, all three main communities spoke a common language, shared an economic space. Social and political loyalty often mattered more than our modern idea of citizenship. Non-Muslims weren't seen as foreigners in quite the same way.
Right.
Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror's famous edict on religious freedom was actually fundamental in Ottoman Bosnia, protecting non-Muslims, acknowledging their existence. So the Republic of Yugoslavia didn't really follow either this Ottoman model or the Western European model of citizenship. It was something different again.
Okay, so given all that history, how did the formal recognition of Muslim identity actually come about in Yugoslavia? It sounds like it took a while.
It was definitely a long and complex process. The idea of recognizing distinct nations was fundamental to the Yugoslav socialist federal model. Eventually, the Socialist Republic recognized 6 nations, and Muslims became one of them. In 1961, Bosnian Muslims were allowed to identify as Muslim in an ethnic sense. Then finally, in 1971, Muslim as a nationality got constitutional recognition.
But it was clearly drawn out. The 48 Constitution called them Muslims without a specific nationality. Later, they could choose Yugoslav without a specific nationality if they didn't pick Serb or Croat. It really highlights that initial lack of a clear political status.
Absolutely. And the Yugoslav view was kind of that Bosnian Muslims were the core of this broader Muslim nation, with communities also in Sanjak, Croatia, Macedonia. Over time, the term Muslim in the Yugoslav system did take on this ethnic meaning. However, the study argues that even the 1971 recognition didn't necessarily mean full equality in practice compared to Serbs and Croats, even though the legal right to declare as Muslim was there. And it's worth remembering, other groups like Albanians and Hungarians were also recognized as ethnic minorities, so it's part of a broader, albeit imperfect, system of recognition. Now let's zoom in specifically on the identity discourse within Bosnia and Herzegovina itself. Its geography, stuck between these competing nationalist powers for so long, clearly made it vulnerable, hugely vulnerable. Being nestled between Serbian and Croatian nationalist ambitions for, 150 years?
Yeah.
That has profoundly shaped Bosnia's politics and even its physical landscape. The study basically says any major socio-political shift in Bosnia is almost impossible without Belgrade and Zagreb getting involved.
And external European powers played a role too, often with interests aligning along religious lines.
Yes, historically Germany and Austria often leaned towards Croatia, while England and France tended to support Belgrade based on geopolitical calculations. That dynamic has been pretty consistent for a long time.
And historically, Ottoman Bosnia was much bigger than today's Bosnia and Herzegovina, right? Including parts of other modern nations.
That's right. The Ottoman retreat and then the Congress of Berlin in 1875 really defined the current borders. And even later, the division of the Sanjak region in 1912 further split up Muslim communities who shared a common culture.
And even today, you have significant Muslim populations in Montenegro, Serbia, Croatia, North Macedonia, Slovenia, and many culturally identify as Bosniaks.
Yes, especially in Sanjak, while they might be economically okay, their cultural and political focus often still points towards Bosnia. Croatian Muslims, too, may be less tied politically or economically, but the cultural connection to Sarajevo is often still there.
So it sounds like this ongoing conversation about national, cultural, religious identity is just absolutely central for Bosnian Muslim intellectuals. It's not just about Bosnia's identity, but also its ties to these neighboring Muslim communities.
Definitely. There's a real sense of shared heritage, of belonging to a common mother culture. The Islamic community of Bosnia and Herzegovina plays a big role in trying to keep those cultural ties alive.
And the study makes a really interesting point, that religion often ends up being the main distinguishing cultural factor between Muslims and their Slavic-speaking neighbors in Bosnia.
Yes, partly because after the Ottoman period, there wasn't this strong, cohesive concept of a single Bosnian national identity that everyone bought into. That absence has been a constant issue for political identity.
It's almost like the differences, mainly religious, became more powerful in shaping identity than all the things they had in common historically, geographically, culturally.
That's a fair assessment of the argument. Differences were emphasized, became the dividing lines. So the current effort, the ongoing project really, to build a stable Bosnian national identity requires actively pushing back against and overcoming those ethnic nationalisms.
Exactly, and a huge part of that involves clarifying, maybe even transforming these key terms.
Yeah.
Let's start with Muslim again. You mentioned the capital M versus lowercase m. Can you break that down a bit more?
Sure. So Muslim, with a capital M that specifically points to Slavic Muslims in a political and national sense. This idea really started forming from the 1960s onwards. Because being Serb or Croat was so tied to ethnic and, frankly, racial perceptions, the communist Muslim elites, sort of strategically, started filling the term Muslim, which already had ethnic undertones with political and social meaning. It was a way to say, we're distinct from Serbs and Croats. The capital M marked that political ethnic self-identification.
And this move wasn't exactly welcomed by everyone. The study mentions the arguments from radical Serbian and Croatian nationalist intellectuals during the socialist period. They really pushed back against Muslim as a national identity.
Oh, strongly. They argued Muslims weren't a real nation, didn't have the right national character, that they were basically just Croats or Serbs who'd converted, so their real identity was Croat or Serb. Ultimately, they claimed the term Muslim had no valid basis for national recognition. It was pure denial.
Which helps explain why, by the 1980s, many Muslim intellectuals outside the Communist Party started feeling uncomfortable with the term Muslim. It felt too limited, too religious. It couldn't capture the whole political, cultural, historical identity they felt they had as a major group in Bosnia.
Exactly. They made the point, quite rightly, that you can't define ethnicity solely by religion. They're related, but distinct. But the problem was, even as they criticized Muslim, they knew there wasn't a ready-made alternative theory or term to define their political and social identity. They were kind of stuck.
And we touched on this, but between 1945 and 1973, they literally had no constitutional national identity. Forced to choose Serb, Croat, or Yugoslav on their ID cards, that must have created a real feeling of political, well, non-existence.
A profound sense of ambiguity, definitely. While Yugoslavia officially recognized various ethnicities, Muslims, Albanians, Roma weren't concluded until '73. So politically, Muslims lacked their own identity under the law. A secondary identity was imposed, unlike for Serbs and Croats, whose Orthodox or Catholic faith largely aligned with their recognized nationality.
So Muslim in socialist Yugoslavia basically meant someone the law recognized, but who lacked their own distinct political or ethnic identity. It sounds almost like a deliberate vacuum, maybe allowing Serbian and Croatian nationalism to try and pull them in, assimilate them.
That's certainly one interpretation the study suggests. And using Muslim right alongside Serb and Croat might have maybe inadvertently pushed Muslims towards a form of religious nationalism as the main way to assert their difference in that ambiguous space. It's also crucial to remember, as the study points out, that go back further, medieval Bosnian kingdom, Ottoman times and Orthodox and Catholic Bosnians weren't necessarily called Serb or Croat. They, along with Muslims, were often just called Bosniaks. Muslim Bosniaks, Orthodox Bosniaks, Catholic Bosniaks.
Right, it was the rise of 19th century nationalism, backed by the new states of Serbia and Croatia, that actively pulled Orthodox towards Belgrade and Catholics towards Zagreb.
And that project was incredibly successful over 150 years. Today, very few non-Muslims in Bosnia identify as Bosniaks. It shows the sheer power of those nationalist movements.
So if Islam itself became the defining national factor for Muslims, that gives religion a very nationalist role.
Exactly. And given the intense Islamophobia in radical Serbian and Croatian nationalism, Defining themselves solely through religion could have actually undermined their fight for political existence, making it seem like Islam was just a tool for nationalism rather than a faith and culture.
Plus, the word Muslim doesn't really have a geographical anchor, does it?
No, not inherently. So all these issues, the ambiguity, the religious-only connotation, the lack of territory, led to this realization, especially as Marxism faded in the 80s, that they needed something else. And that led them back to the term Bosniak.
Okay, Bosniak. The study reminds us it's the Ottoman Turkish take on the Bosnian word for Bosnian nationality, Bosanski. Even Evliya Çelebi, the famous traveler, called the language Boznaski or Bosniaczki, and the people like Bosniaks, everyone living in Bosnia.
That's right. Historically, from the Middle Ages up to the early 19th century, Bosniak had this geographical political meaning. It meant the inhabitants of the land of Bosnia. Then, jump forward to 1993, the first Congress of Muslim Intellectuals officially adopts Bosniak as the definition of their political identity. And that decision naturally kicked off all these ongoing debates about what it really means in the modern world, trying to define a nation-state.
And the study suggests this move kind of fused nationalism and religion in defining identity nationalists using the religious factor to help shape political identity. Before this, Bosniak didn't really carry that modern political weight, so this new usage has geographical roots, but also major legal and political implications now. It was a conscious choice.
A very conscious reclaiming and redefining. And remember the context. Early 90s, Marxism collapses. Suddenly, everyone's focused on the nation again. But the immediate, brutal challenge was this incredibly aggressive ethnic nationalism. Serbs and Croats were pushing their racial nationalist theories, centered in Belgrade and Zagreb. Radical Bosnian, Serb, and Croat elements became, effectively, the military arms of those neighboring countries, aiming to slice up Bosnia. The Milosevic-Tuđman agreement in '91 is proof they were planning the partition months before the war even started.
It's chilling. The plan to divide Bosnia, the ethnic cleansing, forcing Muslims into some small buffer zone. These horrific events must have totally shaped how different groups understood Bosniak.
Absolutely. The aggression from Serbia, then Croatia, plus the constant denial of Muslim political identity, it inevitably strengthened Sarajevo's reaction. And Muslim intellectuals, in defining their ethnic identity as Bosniak, were, in a way, following a similar path laid out by Serbs and Croats. This led to basically two main ways of understanding Bosniak.
Okay, what were those two main interpretations?
So the first interpretation saw Bosniak as essentially meaning Bosnian. It represented a modern nation-state idea, inclusive of everyone, Serbs, Croats, Muslims, Jews, everyone living there. It was trying to revive that older, broader meaning.
Right, the geographical meaning.
Exactly. Thinkers like Muhammad Filipović and Adil Zulfikarpašić really pushed this view. Filipović said explicitly, Bosniak includes all citizens. Zulfikarpašić went further, suggesting even Catholics and Orthodox should embrace this identity, as they were called Bosniaks historically. He argued a unified Bosnia was best for everyone, and this inclusive Bosniak wasn't narrow nationalism because it wasn't exclusive or aggressive.
But as the study notes, in reality, very few Serbs and Croats actually went for that broader identity. So what was the second and seemingly more dominant way Bosniak came to be understood?
Well, the second group, including really influential figures like Alija Izetbegović, Alija Izetković, Mustafa Imamović, Atif Purivatra, they focused on defining Bosniak identity specifically for Muslims. And this approach, arguably paved the way for ethnic nationalism to become more dominant. Izetbegović in particular was influenced by various Islamist thinkers, promoting this idea of returning to a distinct Muslim selfhood. Now, his ideas clearly resonated with the deep desire of Bosnian Muslims for political recognition for survival. But the sheer speed and trauma of the changes in the late 80s, early 90s, there wasn't much time for deep political theorizing. This led him to reject Zulfikarpašić's more inclusive idea.
So Izetbegovic's view of Bosniak kind of wavered between an identity for everyone in Bosnia and a more specific Muslim ethnic identity.
It seems that way, yes.
Well,
and the war, the sheer brutality of it, likely pushed the meaning strongly towards the ethnic interpretation. When you're under attack like that, identities tend to harden along ethnic lines. It happened among Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks.
Understandable, tragically.
While some figures, like Nijaz Duraković, who came from the old Yugoslav system, argued for moving beyond ethnic nationalism towards a civic nationalism based on shared interests, Izetbegović leanings more ethnic nationalist, influenced by Islamist thought, ultimately helped produce an ethnic nationalism rooted in religious identity.
The study also brings up Razmir Mamuchahadzic, another key Bosnian intellectual. He initially defended the Bosniak idea, maybe even from an ethnic angle, but then changed his view.
Yes, Melmudžić Hodžić is interesting. Initially, he apparently held views suggesting Bosniaks were almost a distinct race. But later, he became a vocal critic of the purely ethnic nationalist interpretation. He argued that the main political party, the SDA, and the leadership had basically shrunk the meaning of Bosniak down to just ethnic nationalism, exclusively for Muslims.
So he tried to broaden it again.
He attempted this conceptual shift, trying to move Bosniak nationalism towards a wider concept of national identity. He proposed political and religious pluralism, drawing on this mystical idea of unity and multiplicity.
Sounds quite philosophical, maybe even utopian. Trying to bridge religious divides by focusing on shared Abrahamic roots.
It was definitely idealistic, a kind of liberal utopian rereading of Bosnian nationalism, where Bosnia itself becomes almost sacred.
Yeah.
He wanted to bring religions closer through this mystical interpretation, emphasizing Bosnian nationalism and European integration, seeing religion as collective culture and mysticism as individual experience.
And the study also mentions, unfortunately, more radical takes on Bosniak.
Yes, it acknowledges that among some clergy within the Wahhabi movement, which gained some influence, and a very small number of intellectuals leaning towards fundamentalism, you find more radical interpretations. This sometimes involves a belief in Muslim Bosniaks' superiority over non-Muslims. And during the war, it even led some to push for a separate Muslim-only region. Now, radical Serb and Croat propaganda has often tried to paint this fringe fundamentalism as the main driver for all Bosnian Muslims for the last 20 years. But the study stresses these numbers are very limited, and this interpretation is likely imported, influenced by external Wahhabi infiltration, not really homegrown.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together, it's incredibly clear that Muslim identity in Bosnia, this whole Muslim versus Bosniak discussion, is just deeply complex. It's tangled up in centuries of history, massive political change, and these relentless nationalist forces.
Absolutely. The breakup of Yugoslavia, the fight for identity in the new states, it unleashed this powerful return of ethnic identities. And for Bosniaks in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the challenge continues.
Yeah.
How do you forge a genuinely shared national identity with Serbs and Croats in one state, especially with neighboring countries still having so much influence?
And it seems like there are these two broad paths forward being discussed. One is looking towards Europe economic and political integration, hoping that might foster a more shared, inclusive Bosnian identity.
Right, the integration path.
And the other path emphasizes the need for deeper intellectual work, really critiquing ethnic nationalism itself, arguing that's necessary before you can make real, lasting progress.
Exactly. The argument being that unless you directly tackle and overcome these underlying ethnic nationalist ideas, achieving genuine, sustainable political and economic stability in Bosnia and Herzegovina is going to remain incredibly difficult.
So thinking about all these historical knots, the ongoing debates, what does the future really hold for the collective identity of the people of Bosnia and Herzegovina? And maybe the bigger question is, how can a truly inclusive national identity be built, one that actually transcends these deep ethnic and religious divides? It's a huge question, no easy answers, and one that's clearly still shaping the entire region today.